Hi guys! Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your job involves crawling through narrow tunnels filled with human waste, breathing in toxic fumes that burn your lungs, and emerging at the end of each day covered in filth so putrid that even the poorest members of society cross the street to avoid you. Now imagine this isn't a nightmare, but your actual reality, and not just for a day or a week, but for your entire working life. Welcome to the world of medieval employment, where the phrase worst job ever takes on an entirely new and terrifying meaning. Tonight, we're going to explore the absolute worst jobs in medieval history. Occupations so dreadful, so dangerous, and so socially stigmatizing that they make even the most challenging modern careers seem like luxury vacations. We'll journey through centuries of human suffering, examining the lives of people who had no choice but to accept work that would literally shorten their lives, destroy their health, and mark them as social outcasts. From the gong farmers who cleaned out castle latrines to the professional executioners who lived in constant fear of revenge, from the miners who descended into hell-like conditions daily, to the plague doctors who walked among the dying wearing their terrifying bird-like masks. But this isn't just a catalog of misery. These stories reveal something profound about human resilience, about how people survived and even found dignity in the most degrading circumstances. They show us how our ancestors lived, worked, and died, often in conditions so harsh that they seem almost impossible to believe. Yet these weren't isolated incidents or temporary hardships. For millions of people throughout medieval Europe, Asia, and beyond, these were the realities of daily life for generations. We'll examine not just what these jobs entailed, but why they existed, how society treated those who performed them, and what it meant for families who were often trapped in these occupations for generations. We'll explore the economic systems that created such desperate working conditions, the social hierarchies that maintained them, and the human cost of medieval progress. From the great cathedrals built by workers who regularly fell to their deaths, to the leather goods created by tanners whose life expectancy was cut in half by their trade, every aspect of medieval life was built on the backs of people doing jobs that would destroy their bodies, their health, and their spirits. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Let's begin our exploration with perhaps the most literally repulsive category of medieval employment, the jobs that involved working with human and animal waste, rotting materials, and substances so foul that the mere thought of them would make most modern people physically ill. These weren't temporary assignments or punishment details, but legitimate professions that entire families would be forced into by economic necessity and social circumstance. The gong farmer stands as perhaps the most universally reviled worker in all of medieval society, yet their services were absolutely essential to urban life. The name itself comes from the Anglo-Saxon word gang, meaning to go, combined with farmer, though these men harvested nothing but human waste. In an era before modern plumbing, cities and towns relied on public latrines, private garderobes in castles and wealthy homes, and communal waste pits that would gradually fill up over months or years. When these facilities reached capacity, someone had to clean them out, and that someone was the gong farmer. The work itself defied human dignity in every possible way. Gong farmers would arrive at night carrying crude tools and wearing their oldest, most disposable clothing. They would descend into stone-lined pits or cramped spaces beneath castle walls, often having to crawl on their hands and knees through tunnels barely wide enough for a human body. The waste they encountered wasn't fresh. It had been accumulating for months or even years, creating a toxic soup of decomposing human excrement mixed with rushes, straw, and whatever else had been thrown down the latrines. The smell was so overwhelming that even hardened gong farmers would vomit regularly during their work, adding to the already horrific conditions. But the smell was just the beginning of their ordeal. The accumulated waste created dangerous gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia that could cause unconsciousness, blindness, or death. Many gong farmers died on the job, overcome by toxic fumes in the confined spaces where they worked. Those who survived often suffered from chronic respiratory problems, skin diseases from constant contact with waste, and eye infections that could lead to permanent blindness. The work was so dangerous that gong farmers were actually prohibited by law from working alone. They had to bring partners who could drag them out if they were overcome by fumes. The social consequences of being a gong farmer extended far beyond the immediate physical dangers. These men were required by law to live outside city walls, forbidden from entering taverns, markets, or churches during daylight hours. They could only conduct their business and move through cities at night, and even then they were required to ring bells or call out warnings so that respectable citizens could avoid them. Their families were similarly ostracized. Their children were forbidden from attending school with other children, their wives couldn't shop in regular markets, and the entire family was barred from most churches and religious ceremonies. The legal restrictions placed on gong farmers were so comprehensive that they essentially created a separate caste of untouchables within medieval society. In many cities, gong farmers were required to wear distinctive clothing or badges that identified their profession from a distance, allowing others to avoid contact with them even during their permitted nighttime hours. They were prohibited from touching food in markets, from drawing water from public wells during daylight hours, and from participating in most civic activities, including festivals, parades, and public celebrations that formed the social fabric of medieval community life. The housing situation for gong farmer families was particularly desperate, as they were often relegated to the worst possible locations within or outside city boundaries. These areas were typically downwind from the main population, near industrial sites that produced noxious smells and waste, or in flood-prone areas that no one else wanted. The houses themselves were often little more than hovels, built from scrap materials and lacking basic amenities that even poor families in the main city might enjoy. The combination of their revolting profession and their enforced isolation meant that gong farmer communities became breeding grounds for disease, crime, and social dysfunction. Perhaps most tragically, the children of gong farmers were trapped in a cycle of inherited shame and limited opportunities that was almost impossible to escape. Even if a gong farmer's child showed exceptional intelligence or talent, the social stigma of their father's profession would follow them throughout their lives. Apprenticeships in respectable trades were virtually impossible to obtain, as master craftsmen feared that association with a gong farmer's child would damage their own reputations. This meant that most children of gong farmers had little choice but to enter the same profession that had destroyed their fathers' lives, perpetuating the cycle of degradation and social exclusion for generations. The economic exploitation of gong farmers was as systematic as their social exclusion. While they were paid relatively well for individual jobs, the irregular nature of the work meant that income was unpredictable and often insufficient to support families during slack periods. Moreover, the tools and equipment required for their trade were expensive and had to be frequently replaced due to the corrosive nature of their work environment. Special clothing, protective gear, and cleaning materials all had to be purchased at premium prices, often from merchants who charged extra for dealing with such despised customers. The health consequences of gong farming extended beyond the immediate dangers of toxic exposure and physical injury. The psychological impact of performing such degrading work, combined with constant social rejection, created mental health problems that were not understood or addressed in medieval times. Many gong farmers developed what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse problems as they struggled to cope with their circumstances. The isolation from normal social interaction meant that these psychological problems often went unrecognized and untreated, adding another layer of suffering to already difficult lives. The economic reality of being a gong farmer was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Despite performing work that no one else would do, despite the health risks and social ostracism, gong farmers were paid relatively well compared to other manual laborers. This wasn't out of respect or recognition of their sacrifice, but because the demand for their services was constant and the supply of people willing to do the work was understandably limited. However, much of their earnings went toward the constant replacement of tools, clothing, and other materials destroyed by their work, and toward medical treatments for the endless health problems caused by their occupation. Moving from waste management to another category of revolting medieval work, we encounter the tanners and leather workers, whose profession involved transforming animal hides into usable leather through processes so foul and dangerous that entire neighborhoods would be designated as tanning districts, located downwind and downstream from the rest of the community. The production of leather was essential to medieval life. It was used for everything from shoes and clothing to armor, bookbindings, and water containers. But the process of creating it was a nightmare of toxic chemicals, rotting organic matter, and backbreaking labor. The tanning process began with the collection of animal hides from butchers and slaughterhouses, but these weren't fresh, clean skins. By the time they reached the tanner, the hides were often partially decomposed, crawling with maggots, and emitting a stench that could be detected from considerable distances. The first step in the tanning process involved soaking these putrid hides in pits filled with urine, both human and animal, collected from throughout the community. The ammonia in the urine helped break down the proteins in the hide, but it also created an atmosphere so toxic that tanners regularly suffered from respiratory problems, chemical burns, and chronic nausea. After weeks of soaking in urine, the hides were moved to lime pits, where they were treated with caustic lime solutions that would burn human skin on contact. Tanners had to work with these chemicals using only their bare hands and crude tools, resulting in permanent scarring, chemical burns, and skin conditions that never healed. The lime treatment was followed by another soaking process, this time in pits filled with dog feces, bird droppings, and other organic waste that provided the enzymes necessary for further breaking down the hide. Workers would spend their days stirring these vile mixtures with long poles, breathing in the toxic vapors, and frequently splashing the corrosive solutions on their skin and clothing. The chemical processes involved in tanning were not only disgusting, but also incredibly dangerous in ways that medieval people didn't fully understand. The lime solutions used were highly alkaline, with pH levels that could reach dangerous extremes. Prolonged exposure to these chemicals didn't just cause immediate burns, it led to chronic skin conditions that would worsen over time, including dermatitis, eczema, and skin ulcers that refused to heal. The calcium hydroxide in lime solutions could also cause respiratory problems when inhaled as dust or vapor, leading to chronic coughing, breathing difficulties, and lung damage that would progressively worsen throughout a tanner's working life. The organic materials used in the later stages of tanning created their own unique health hazards. The dog feces and bird droppings that provided essential enzymes for breaking down hides were collected from throughout the community, often including waste from diseased animals. This created constant exposure to parasites, bacteria, and other pathogens that could cause intestinal diseases, skin infections, and other serious health problems. Tanners frequently suffered from chronic diarrhea, stomach pains, and intestinal parasites that they contracted through contact with contaminated organic matter. The water used in tanning operations was another source of contamination and disease. Most tanning operations relied on local streams, rivers, or wells for the massive quantities of water needed to rinse hides between treatment stages. However, the same water sources were often contaminated by waste from the tanning process itself, creating a cycle of pollution that affected not just the tanners, but entire communities downstream from tanning operations. The water used in later stages of processing would become so contaminated with chemicals and organic waste that it could kill fish and other aquatic life, while also creating health hazards for anyone who came into contact with it. The tools and equipment used by tanners were primitive and dangerous, adding another layer of risk to an already hazardous occupation. Knives used to scrape hides were kept razor sharp but lacked proper handles or guards, making cuts and lacerations a constant danger. The poles used to stir chemical solutions were often rough-cut wood that would splinter and cause injuries, while the containers holding caustic chemicals were frequently cracked or damaged, leading to spills and accidental exposure. The lack of protective equipment meant that tanners had no defense against the multiple hazards of their work environment except their own experience and caution. Working conditions in medieval tanneries were made even worse by the physical environment in which the work took place. Most tanning operations were conducted in poorly ventilated buildings or outdoor areas where workers had no protection from weather conditions. In winter, tanners might have to break ice on chemical solutions to continue their work, while in summer, the combination of heat and chemical fumes created almost unbearable working conditions. The floors of tanning facilities were typically earthen and would become saturated with spilled chemicals and organic waste, creating slippery, toxic surfaces that were dangerous to walk on and impossible to properly clean. The social segregation of tanners was reinforced by religious beliefs and superstitions that portrayed their work as spiritually contaminating. Many medieval Christians believed that contact with certain substances could corrupt the soul as well as the body, and the revolting materials used in tanning were often included in this category. Some religious authorities taught that tanners were spiritually unclean and should be excluded from certain religious ceremonies, while popular superstitions held that tanners could spread bad luck or evil influences through their contaminated presence. The marriage prospects for tanners and their children were severely limited by social prejudices and practical considerations. Few families wanted to form alliances with tanning families, both because of the social stigma and because of legitimate concerns about the health risks associated with the trade. This meant that tanners often married within their own profession, creating communities of tanning families who were isolated from the broader social structure. These marriages were often arranged more out of practical necessity than romantic attachment, as parents sought to secure economic partnerships that would help their families survive in their marginalized social position. The physical demands of tanning work were as brutal as the chemical hazards. Hides had to be constantly moved between different treatment pits, requiring workers to lift and carry waterlogged animal skins that could weigh hundreds of pounds. The stirring and mixing processes required hours of repetitive motion that destroyed joints and muscles over time. Many tanners developed severe arthritis in their 30s, chronic back problems that left them unable to stand upright, and respiratory conditions that made breathing increasingly difficult with each passing year. Perhaps most tragically, the life expectancy of tanners was significantly lower than that of other medieval workers. Most died in their 40s or early 50s from a combination of chemical poisoning, respiratory failure, and the cumulative effects of years of physical abuse. Their families often lived in poverty despite the essential nature of their work, as much of their income went toward medical treatments and the constant replacement of clothing and tools destroyed by the chemicals they worked with daily. The fullers and cloth cleaners represent another category of medieval workers whose jobs involved constant exposure to disgusting and dangerous substances. In an age before soap was widely available, and when most people owned only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, the cleaning and maintenance of textiles was a crucial but revolting profession. Fullers were responsible for cleaning newly woven cloth to remove oils, dirt, and other impurities, while also treating it to make it thicker and more durable. The process they used would make modern people physically ill just thinking about it. The primary cleaning agent used by fullers was human urine, collected in large quantities from public urinals and private homes throughout the community. Fresh urine was actually preferred over aged urine for certain parts of the process, which meant that fullers had to maintain a constant supply of this revolting substance. They would soak cloth in large vats of urine, then stomp on it with their bare feet for hours at a time, working the fabric between their toes to break down fibers and remove impurities. This wasn't a quick process. A single piece of cloth might require days of treatment, with workers standing knee-deep in pools of urine for 8 to 10 hours at a time. The stomping process was just the beginning of the fuller's ordeal. After the initial urine treatment, the cloth had to be rinsed in water, then treated with various clay solutions and other chemicals that would further break down oils and impurities. The clay used in this process often contained arsenic and other toxic substances that would be absorbed through the worker's skin over time, leading to chronic poisoning that manifested as hair loss, skin lesions, and nervous system problems. The constant exposure to wet conditions and harsh chemicals also led to severe foot problems, including fungal infections, open sores, and deformities caused by years of standing in caustic solutions. But the physical suffering of fullers was compounded by the social stigma attached to their profession. Like gong farmers and tanners, fullers were often segregated from the rest of the community, forced to live in designated areas, and prohibited from entering certain establishments. The smell that clung to their bodies and clothing was so persistent and offensive that they were easily identifiable even when not working, making it impossible for them to blend into normal society. Their children often inherited not just the family profession, but also the social ostracism that came with it, creating generational cycles of poverty and marginalization. The butchers and slaughterhouse workers of medieval times faced working conditions that would horrify even modern meat processing workers, who already deal with some of the most challenging industrial conditions. Medieval slaughterhouses were not the regulated, inspected facilities we know today, but crude operations where animals were processed in the most basic and often unsanitary conditions possible. Workers in these facilities dealt with blood, gore, and waste on a scale that defied imagination, all while working with sharp tools under dangerous conditions that regularly resulted in serious injuries and death. The slaughter process itself was brutal and chaotic. Animals were often brought to slaughterhouses already stressed, sick, or injured, and the methods used to kill them were crude and imprecise. Workers would use hammers, axes, and knives to kill cattle, pigs, and sheep, often requiring multiple blows or cuts before the animals died. The floors of slaughterhouses were constantly soaked with blood, creating slippery conditions that led to frequent accidents with sharp tools. Workers regularly cut themselves, sometimes severely, and in an age before antibiotics or proper wound care, these injuries often became infected and could lead to blood poisoning or death. The processing of carcasses after slaughter created additional hazards and horrors. Workers had to skin animals by hand, often while the carcasses were still warm and twitching. They would remove organs and intestines, frequently rupturing them in the process and releasing their contents all over themselves and their work area. The smell of blood, excrement, and decomposing organic matter was so intense that many workers would vomit regularly during their shifts, adding to the already disgusting conditions. In hot weather, the combination of blood, waste, and rotting meat would attract massive swarms of flies and other insects, making the work environment even more unbearable. Now, we turn our attention to what many historians consider the most dangerous category of medieval employment, the jobs that regularly killed or permanently disabled the people who performed them. While all medieval work was dangerous compared to modern standards, certain occupations had death rates so high that taking these jobs was essentially a form of slow suicide. Yet economic necessity forced millions of people into these professions, where they would work until injury, disease, or death claimed them. Miners and quarry workers faced perhaps the most consistently lethal working conditions in all of medieval society. The extraction of coal, iron ore, stone, and other materials required workers to descend into underground spaces that were essentially death traps, where cave-ins, toxic gases, flooding, and explosions were constant threats. The technology available to medieval miners was primitive at best. They used simple hand tools, crude wooden supports, and oil lamps or candles for light, creating conditions where disaster was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The daily routine of a medieval miner began before dawn, as workers would gather at the mine entrance to receive their assignments and primitive equipment. They would then descend into the earth through narrow shafts, often climbing down crude wooden ladders or being lowered in baskets operated by hand-cranked winches. The tunnels they worked in were barely tall enough for a man to stand upright, forcing miners to spend their entire shifts crouched over or crawling on their hands and knees. The air in these tunnels was thick with dust that would gradually destroy their lungs, creating a condition that would later be recognized as pneumoconiosis, or black lung disease. The actual work of mining was backbreaking and dangerous beyond belief. Using hammers, chisels, and crude picks, miners would chip away at rock faces for hours at a time, creating clouds of dust that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. The wooden supports used to shore up tunnel walls were often inadequate for the weight they were supporting, and cave-ins were a daily occurrence. When a tunnel collapsed, miners trapped inside were usually left to die, as rescue operations were dangerous and expensive, and the lives of miners were considered expendable by the mine owners. Water was another constant threat in medieval mines. Underground springs and seepage would gradually flood mining tunnels, and the primitive pumping systems available couldn't keep up with the inflow during heavy rains or spring melts. Miners would often work standing in knee-deep water, using buckets and crude hand pumps to try to keep their work areas dry. When major flooding occurred, entire sections of mines would be abandoned, often with workers still trapped inside. The mortality rate among miners was so high that most didn't live to see their 40th birthday, and those who did were usually so disabled by lung disease, back injuries, and other occupational hazards that they couldn't continue working. The social structure within mining communities was shaped by the constant presence of death and the knowledge that every worker was living on borrowed time. Mining families developed their own cultural traditions and support systems that reflected their unique circumstances. Funeral rites were simplified and practical, as communities couldn't afford elaborate ceremonies for the frequent deaths that occurred. Wedding celebrations were often subdued affairs, as families couldn't invest heavily in festivities for unions that might be cut short by industrial accidents or occupational diseases. The economic system surrounding medieval mining was particularly exploitative, as mine owners had little incentive to invest in safety measures or worker welfare when replacement laborers were readily available. The feudal system that governed much of medieval society meant that many miners were essentially property of their lords, with no legal right to refuse dangerous assignments or seek better working conditions elsewhere. Even free miners had limited options, as the skills required for mining were not easily transferable to other occupations, and the physical disabilities that accumulated over time made it difficult to transition to different types of work. Mining communities developed their own informal systems of medical care that reflected both their isolation from mainstream society and their unique health challenges. Local healers specialized in treating mining injuries and occupational diseases, developing folk remedies and treatment methods that were often more effective than the medical care available in towns and cities. However, these community healers were limited by the same lack of scientific knowledge that affected all medieval medicine, and they could do little to prevent or cure the long-term health problems that were inevitable consequences of mining work. The psychological impact of mining work extended beyond the individual miners to their families and communities. Children who grew up in mining areas lived with the constant awareness that their fathers might not return from work each day, creating chronic anxiety and emotional trauma that affected entire generations. Wives and mothers developed their own coping mechanisms for dealing with the stress of having loved ones in such dangerous work, often turning to religion, alcohol, or other forms of emotional escape. The environmental consequences of medieval mining were devastating and long-lasting, affecting not just the immediate mining areas, but entire regions downstream and downwind from mining operations. The techniques used to extract metals from ore involved smelting processes that released toxic fumes into the air, poisoning crops and livestock for miles around mining sites. Water sources were contaminated by mining waste and chemical runoff, making them unsafe for drinking or irrigation, and destroying aquatic ecosystems that communities depended on for food and transportation. The waste products from mining operations created permanent scars on the landscape that served as visible reminders of the human cost of medieval industry. Slag heaps and tailings piles would accumulate near mining sites, creating toxic monuments that would leach poisonous chemicals into soil and water for centuries after the mines themselves were abandoned. These environmental hazards affected not just mining communities, but also agricultural areas and downstream settlements that had no direct connection to mining operations. The technology used in medieval mining was not only primitive, but often counterproductive, creating additional hazards while failing to improve efficiency or safety. The wooden supports used to shore up mine tunnels were often inadequate for the geological conditions they encountered, leading to frequent collapses that could have been prevented with better engineering knowledge. The oil lamps and candles used for lighting created fire hazards in environments that were often filled with explosive gases, while the simple tools used for digging and hauling ore required enormous physical effort that wore out workers' bodies at an accelerated rate. Ventilation in medieval mines was virtually non-existent, creating accumulations of toxic gases that made breathing difficult and sometimes impossible. Miners would work in air so thick with dust and fumes that they could barely see their tools, while carbon monoxide and other poisonous gases would accumulate in poorly ventilated areas and kill workers without warning. The lack of understanding about air quality and gas detection meant that miners had no way to assess the safety of their working environment except through trial and error, often learning about deadly conditions only after fellow workers had been overcome by toxic fumes. Construction workers and masons in medieval times faced death rates that would be unacceptable in any modern industry. The great cathedrals, castles, and other monuments of the medieval period were built by workers who labored without safety equipment, proper training, or adequate supervision, resulting in accident rates that were truly staggering. Building a single large cathedral might cost the lives of hundreds of workers over the decades-long construction period, yet these deaths were accepted as a normal part of the building process. The construction of tall stone buildings required workers to perform tasks at dangerous heights using primitive equipment and techniques. Scaffolding was built from rough-cut timber lashed together with rope, creating unstable platforms that would sway in the wind and collapse without warning. Workers carried heavy stones and timbers up these rickety structures using crude pulleys and rope systems that regularly failed, sending both materials and workers plummeting to the ground below. The mortality rate from falls alone was enormous, but falls were just one of many dangers faced by construction workers. The quarrying and shaping of stone for construction created additional hazards that claimed countless lives. Workers used hammers and chisels to break apart massive stone blocks, often working directly beneath unstable rock faces that could shift and crush them without warning. Stone chips would fly into workers' eyes, causing blindness, while the constant pounding required to shape stones would destroy joints and muscles over time. Many masons developed severe arthritis in their 20s and 30s, leaving them unable to continue their trade just when they were reaching their peak earning years. The lifting and moving of heavy stones was another source of constant danger and injury. Medieval cranes were simple wooden structures operated by human power, often using tread wheels where workers would walk inside large wooden wheels to provide the power needed to lift multi-ton stone blocks. These tread wheels were notorious for accidents. Workers could be crushed if they fell inside the wheel, and the crude braking systems often failed, causing heavy loads to fall on workers below. The physical strain of operating these devices was enormous, and workers regularly suffered hernias, back injuries, and heart problems from the extreme exertion required. The tread wheel cranes that were central to medieval construction represent some of the most dangerous machinery ever devised for regular use. These massive wooden wheels, sometimes reaching 15 feet in diameter, required workers to walk on the inside rim like hamsters in a wheel, using their body weight and leg power to rotate the wheel and operate the lifting mechanism. The work was exhausting beyond description, as teams of workers would spend hours at a time walking steadily uphill inside these wheels, generating the power needed to lift stone blocks that could weigh several tons. The danger of working in treadwheel cranes came not just from the physical exertion required, but from the primitive safety mechanisms that were supposed to control the lifting process. The braking systems consisted of simple wooden blocks that could be pressed against the wheel to slow or stop its rotation, but these systems were unreliable and often ineffective when dealing with heavy loads. When a brake failed, or when workers lost their footing inside the wheel, the results were catastrophic. The sudden acceleration of the wheel could throw workers against the wooden framework with bone-breaking force, while the lifting mechanism would go out of control, potentially dropping heavy loads on construction sites below. The working conditions inside treadwheel cranes were claustrophobic and terrifying, as workers were essentially trapped inside moving machinery for hours at a time. The wooden construction of the wheels meant that they would creak and groan ominously under load, giving workers constant reminders of how precarious their situation was. In hot weather, the interior of the wheels would become stifling and airless, leading to heat exhaustion and fainting that could cause workers to lose their footing and fall. In winter, ice and snow would make the interior surfaces slippery and even more dangerous than usual. The coordination required between workers inside the tread wheels and those directing the lifting operations on the construction site was complex and often inadequate. Communication was difficult across the noisy construction environment, and misunderstandings between crane operators and ground crews regularly led to accidents. Workers inside the wheels had no direct view of what was being lifted or where it was being placed, making them completely dependent on signals from other workers who might be distracted, inexperienced, or simply unable to see all the hazards involved in a particular lifting operation. The construction of scaffolding systems used in medieval building projects was another source of constant danger that claimed countless lives over the centuries. These temporary structures were built from whatever timber was available locally, often using wood that was green, poorly seasoned, or structurally defective. The joints were held together with rope lashings, wooden pegs, and simple metal brackets that provided minimal structural integrity. As buildings rose higher and scaffolding systems became more complex, these primitive construction methods proved increasingly inadequate for the loads and stresses they were expected to bear. The design of medieval scaffolding was based on practical experience rather than engineering principles, leading to structures that were often inadequate for their intended purpose. Platform levels were frequently overcrowded with workers, tools, and building materials, creating loads that exceeded the scaffolding's capacity. The lack of standardized construction techniques meant that each scaffolding system was essentially a unique experiment, with no guarantee that methods that had worked on previous projects would be adequate for current conditions. Weather conditions created additional hazards for scaffolding systems that were already structurally marginal. Rain would soak into the wooden framework, adding weight, while also making surfaces slippery and treacherous. Wind could sway tall scaffolding structures dramatically, terrifying workers and sometimes causing complete collapses. Snow and ice created especially dangerous conditions, as the added weight could overload the structure while also making it virtually impossible for workers to maintain their footing on narrow wooden platforms. The maintenance of scaffolding systems during long construction projects was often inadequate, as builders were reluctant to spend time and money replacing components that appeared to be functioning adequately. Wooden elements would gradually weaken due to weather exposure, insect damage, and the stress of repeated loading. But these problems were often not apparent until catastrophic failures occurred. Rope lashings would stretch and loosen over time, creating connections that appeared secure but could fail without warning under load. Blacksmiths and metalworkers faced a different but equally deadly set of occupational hazards. Working with fire, molten metal, and toxic fumes in poorly ventilated workshops, these craftsmen were constantly exposed to burns, poisoning, and respiratory problems that would gradually destroy their health over years of exposure. The forges they worked at burned continuously, creating temperatures that could reach over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while the lack of proper ventilation meant that toxic smoke and fumes would fill their workshops, creating air that was barely breathable. The daily work of a blacksmith involved constant risk of severe burns and injuries. Handling red-hot iron with primitive tools and minimal protective equipment, smiths would regularly burn their hands, arms, and faces when sparks flew or when hot metal touched their skin. These burns often became infected in an era before antibiotics, leading to blood poisoning that could be fatal. The constant exposure to extreme heat also caused dehydration and heat stroke, particularly during summer months when workshop temperatures could become unbearable. The toxic fumes produced by metalworking were perhaps even more dangerous than the physical hazards. Smelting operations produced lead vapor, arsenic compounds, and other toxic gases that would gradually poison workers over time. Many metal workers developed what was known as painter's colic or dry bellyache, symptoms we now recognize as lead poisoning, which could cause severe abdominal pain, paralysis, and eventually death. The use of mercury in certain metalworking processes also led to mercury poisoning, causing tremors, memory loss, and psychological problems that earned sufferers the label of being mad as a hatter. Ship workers and dock laborers in medieval ports faced dangers both from their immediate work environment and from the diseases and hazards that came with maritime trade. Loading and unloading ships required workers to handle enormous weights using primitive equipment, often while working on unstable surfaces and in dangerous weather conditions. The mortality rate among dock workers was extraordinarily high, with deaths from accidents, drowning, and occupational diseases being daily occurrences in busy ports. The loading of medieval ships was accomplished entirely through human muscle power, with workers using block and tackle systems to lift cargo that could weigh several tons. These rope and pulley systems regularly failed, dropping heavy loads on workers below or sending workers themselves plummeting into ship holds or into the water. The wooden docks and piers where this work took place were often in poor repair, with rotting planks that could collapse without warning, sending workers into harbors filled with sewage, industrial waste, and other hazardous materials. But perhaps even more dangerous than the immediate physical hazards were the diseases that dock workers were constantly exposed to through their contact with international trade. Ships arriving from foreign ports brought not just cargo, but also rats, insects, and other disease vectors that could spread plague, typhus, and other deadly diseases throughout port communities. Dock workers were usually the first to be exposed to these diseases, and their cramped living conditions in port neighborhoods meant that epidemics would spread rapidly through their communities. The bubonic plague that devastated Europe in the 14th century spread primarily through port cities, with dock workers and their families being among the first and most severely affected victims. The social consequences of working in these dangerous professions extended far beyond the immediate risks to the workers themselves. Families of miners, construction workers, blacksmiths, and dock laborers lived in constant fear that their breadwinner might not return home at the end of the day. The high mortality rates in these professions meant that widows and orphans were common, creating cycles of poverty and desperation that could trap families for generations. Children who lost their fathers to industrial accidents often had no choice but to enter the same dangerous professions that had killed their parents, perpetuating the cycle of suffering and early death. Yet, despite these horrific conditions, there were also examples of medieval workers organizing to protect themselves and improve their working conditions. Early guilds sometimes included safety requirements and mutual aid provisions for disabled workers and the families of those killed on the job. Some construction projects included payments to the families of workers killed during building, and certain mining operations developed primitive safety procedures that slightly reduced the death toll. However, these improvements were limited and came slowly, often taking centuries to develop and implement. Beyond the physically dangerous and filthy jobs we've examined, medieval society also included a category of occupations that were considered so morally reprehensible and socially contaminating that the people who performed them were treated as pariahs, outcasts who were barely considered human by the rest of society. These jobs were necessary for the functioning of medieval communities, but the people who did them paid a terrible price in social isolation, religious condemnation, and psychological trauma that could last for generations. The executioner represents perhaps the most complex and psychologically devastating of these despised professions. While modern society might view executioners as simply performing a legal function, medieval communities saw them as spiritually corrupted individuals whose contact with death and violence made them dangerous to be around. Most executioners inherited their positions from their fathers, creating dynasties of social outcasts who were simultaneously feared and reviled by the communities they served. The daily life of a medieval executioner was shaped by isolation and fear. They were typically required to live outside city walls or in designated areas away from respectable citizens. Their homes were often marked with special symbols to warn others of their profession, and they were forbidden from entering taverns, markets, or churches during normal hours. When they did venture into town, they were required to wear distinctive clothing or carry bells to announce their presence, allowing others to avoid contact with them. This isolation wasn't just social, but also economic. Executioners were often prohibited from engaging in other trades or businesses, making them completely dependent on their gruesome profession for survival. The psychological toll of regularly taking human lives was enormous, even in a society that was far more accepting of violence than our own. Medieval executioners were responsible not just for quick beheadings, but also for torturing confessions out of prisoners, carrying out elaborate public punishments, and disposing of the bodies of their victims. They might be called upon to burn heretics alive, draw and quarter traitors, or slowly strangle common criminals, all while crowds of spectators watched and cheered. The cumulative effect of years of inflicting pain and death on other human beings was profound psychological damage that often manifested as alcoholism, depression, and violent behavior within their own families. What made the executioner's position even more tragic was that many were essentially trapped in their profession by circumstances beyond their control. Sons of executioners had few other options for employment, as other tradesmen wouldn't accept them as apprentices, and most communities wouldn't hire them for regular work. Even if an executioner wanted to leave his profession, the social stigma attached to his previous work would follow him for the rest of his life. Some executioners' families attempted to escape their fate by moving to distant communities where their background wasn't known, but the specialized knowledge and skills required for execution meant that they were often discovered and forced back into their hereditary profession. The training process for new executioners was itself a form of psychological torture that began in childhood. Sons born into executioner families would gradually be introduced to their future profession through a series of increasingly disturbing experiences designed to desensitize them to violence and death. They might begin by helping to maintain executioner equipment, then progress to assisting with tortures and interrogations, and finally participate in actual executions as apprentices under their father's supervision. This gradual exposure to brutality was intended to make them effective in their roles, But it also systematically destroyed their capacity for normal human empathy and emotional development. The social isolation experienced by executioner families was so complete that they often developed their own subcultures and traditions that were completely separate from mainstream medieval society. These communities had their own customs, religious practices, and social hierarchies that reflected their unique position outside normal civilization. Executioner families would often intermarry with each other, creating networks of related families who shared the burden of their profession, while also perpetuating the cycle of social exclusion that trapped their children in the same roles. The economic situation of executioners was paradoxical and cruel in ways that reflected the broader contradictions of their social position. While they were well paid for individual executions, the irregular nature of their work meant that income was unpredictable and often insufficient to support families during periods when no executions were scheduled. Moreover, the specialized nature of their profession meant that they had few opportunities for supplementary income, as most other trades were closed to them due to social prejudice and religious restrictions. The tools and equipment used by medieval executioners were sophisticated and expensive, requiring significant investment and maintenance that further complicated their economic situation. Execution swords had to be specially made and maintained by skilled smiths, who were often reluctant to work with executioners, leading to higher costs and supply difficulties. The blocks, restraints, and other apparatus used for executions had to be transported between different execution sites, requiring executioners to maintain wagons, horses, and other equipment that represented substantial ongoing expenses. The psychological impact of serving as an executioner extended beyond the immediate trauma of taking human lives to include the constant awareness of being hated and feared by the community they served. Executioners lived with the knowledge that many of the people they had executed had families and friends who might seek revenge, creating a constant state of anxiety about personal safety. Some executioners' families lived in fortified houses or maintained armed guards, while others simply accepted the risk of retaliation as an inevitable part of their situation. The religious implications of serving as an executioner created additional psychological burdens that were particularly difficult to bear in the deeply religious culture of medieval society. While civil authorities might justify executions as necessary for maintaining law and order, the Church's teachings about the sanctity of human life created moral conflicts that executioners had to resolve within their own consciences. Some executioners became deeply religious as a way of seeking forgiveness for their role in taking lives, while others rejected religious faith entirely, unable to reconcile their profession with Christian teachings about mercy and redemption. The public nature of most medieval executions created unique psychological pressures that distinguished executioners from soldiers or others who might kill in the course of their duties. Executions were typically public spectacles attended by hundreds or even thousands of spectators who came to witness the proceedings as entertainment. This meant that executioners had to perform their duties in front of hostile crowds who viewed them with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, while also dealing with the emotional responses of the condemned prisoners' families and friends who might be present in the audience. Grave diggers and others who worked with dead bodies faced similar social ostracism, though their work was perhaps less psychologically traumatic than that of executioners. In an era when disease was poorly understood and death was often attributed to supernatural causes, those who handled corpses were believed to carry spiritual contamination that could spread to others through casual contact. Grave diggers, body washers, and funeral attendants were therefore isolated from normal society and forced to live as social outcasts. The actual work of grave digging in medieval times was far more dangerous and disgusting than it might initially appear. Most medieval cemeteries were overcrowded, with bodies buried in shallow graves that would often be disturbed when new graves were dug. Grave diggers regularly encountered partially decomposed corpses from previous burials, along with the overwhelming stench of decay and the constant presence of rats and other scavengers attracted to the cemetery. During plague years, when deaths occurred faster than graves could be dug, bodies would be stacked in mass graves or temporary burial pits, creating conditions so horrific that even hardened grave diggers would sometimes refuse to work. The health hazards faced by those who worked with dead bodies were enormous. Decomposing corpses produced toxic gases that could cause unconsciousness or death, while contact with diseased bodies could transmit plague, typhus, and other deadly diseases to the workers handling them. Grave diggers had a significantly higher mortality rate than other laborers, not just from disease, but also from the physical dangers of their work. Cave-ins from poorly dug graves, injuries from crude digging tools, and exhaustion from the demanding physical nature of their job. Rat catchers and pest controllers occupied another reviled position in medieval society, though their services were desperately needed in communities plagued by vermin that spread disease and destroyed food supplies. The methods used to control rat populations were primitive and dangerous, often involving the use of poisons that were as hazardous to the rat catchers as they were to their intended targets. These workers would spend their time in sewers, basements, and other dark, confined spaces where rats congregated, using crude traps, clubs, and toxic baits to reduce pest populations. The social stigma attached to rat catching came partly from the association with filth and disease, but also from the widespread belief that those who worked closely with vermin became somehow contaminated by that contact. Rat catchers were often suspected of practicing witchcraft or dark magic, since their ability to track and eliminate rats seemed almost supernatural to medieval people who didn't understand pest behavior. This suspicion made rat catchers objects of fear and superstition, leading to their isolation from normal society and sometimes to accusations of heresy or devil worship. The physical dangers faced by rat catchers were considerable. Working in dark, confined spaces with primitive lighting, they were constantly at risk of falls, cave-ins, and encounters with other dangerous animals that might inhabit the same spaces as rats. The poisons they used were often as toxic to humans as to rodents, leading to chronic poisoning that caused hair loss, skin problems, and nervous system damage. Many rat catchers also suffered from numerous bites and scratches from the animals they hunted, leading to infections and diseases that could be fatal in an era without antibiotics. Perhaps most tragically, those who worked with lepers and other disease victims faced the harshest social ostracism of all, despite performing what was arguably the most charitable and necessary work in medieval society. Leper hospitals and pest houses required attendants who would feed, clean, and care for patients with highly contagious diseases, knowing that they were likely to contract these diseases themselves through their daily contact with the afflicted. The attendants in leper hospitals lived lives of almost monastic isolation, cut off from all contact with healthy society and forbidden from leaving the hospital grounds except in the most extreme circumstances. They knew when they took these positions that they were essentially condemning themselves to death, as prolonged exposure to leprosy and other diseases made infection almost inevitable. Yet these positions continued to be filled by people driven by religious conviction, economic desperation, or family obligation to care for afflicted relatives. The psychological burden of watching patients slowly deteriorate and die from horrible diseases, while knowing that the same fate likely awaited them, created a unique form of mental anguish that few other medieval workers experienced. Many leper hospital attendants turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication to cope with the daily horror of their work, while others became fanatically religious, viewing their work as a form of martyrdom that would guarantee them salvation in the afterlife. The economic realities of these despised professions created additional layers of suffering for the families involved. While some of these jobs paid relatively well due to their dangerous or unpleasant nature, much of the income was offset by the additional costs of living as social outcasts. Executioners, gravediggers, and other despised workers often had to pay premium prices for food, clothing, and other necessities because regular merchants would refuse to serve them or would charge them extra for the privilege. Their children were barred from most schools and apprenticeships, perpetuating cycles of poverty and social isolation that could last for generations. Yet, even within these despised professions, there were hierarchies and distinctions that reflected the complex social structures of medieval society. Master executioners who served major cities or royal courts enjoyed higher status than those who worked in small towns, while gravediggers who worked for wealthy churches or monasteries were considered more respectable than those who buried paupers and criminals. These distinctions, while small, provided some hope for advancement and improvement within otherwise hopeless situations. Another category of medieval employment that deserves examination includes the jobs that, while not necessarily despised by society, demanded such extreme physical exertion that they would literally wear out human bodies within a few years of beginning work. These occupations required workers to push their bodies beyond normal human limits on a daily basis, leading to premature aging, chronic pain, and early death from sheer physical exhaustion. Agricultural laborers and serfs represented the largest group of physically demanding workers in medieval society, and their lives were characterized by back-breaking labor that continued from dawn to dusk throughout most of the year. Unlike modern farmers who use machinery to assist with planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops, medieval agricultural workers did everything by hand using simple tools that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The daily routine of a medieval farm laborer began before sunrise and continued until after dark during busy seasons. Plowing was accomplished using primitive wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses, but the laborer had to guide the plow by hand, fighting to keep it moving in straight lines through soil that was often rocky and difficult to work. This required enormous upper body strength and stamina, as the plow would constantly catch on rocks or roots, requiring the worker to wrestle it free while maintaining control of the draft animals. Harvesting grain crops was perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of agricultural work. Using sickles or scythes, workers would spend weeks cutting grain by hand, bending over constantly to gather the cut stalks and tie them into bundles. This repetitive motion, performed for 10 to 12 hours a day during harvest season, would cause severe back problems that plagued agricultural workers for the rest of their lives. Many developed what we would now recognize as chronic arthritis and spinal problems that left them partially disabled by their 30s. The threshing of grain after harvest required workers to use flails to separate grain from stalks, a process that involved swinging heavy wooden implements over their heads for hours at a time. This created enormous strain on shoulders, backs, and arms, while the clouds of dust created during threshing led to respiratory problems that grew worse with each passing harvest season. The winnowing process, which separated grain from chaff, required workers to repeatedly lift and pour grain from baskets held above their heads, creating additional strain on already overworked muscles and joints. Water carriers and manual laborers in medieval cities faced similar physical demands, but in an urban environment that presented its own unique challenges. In an era before municipal water systems, all water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and industrial use had to be carried by hand from wells, rivers, or other sources to wherever it was needed. This created a class of workers whose entire working lives revolved around lifting and carrying enormous weights over long distances. The typical water carrier would begin work before dawn, filling large containers that could weigh over 100 pounds when full, then carrying them through city streets to deliver water to homes, businesses, and workshops. The containers were carried on their backs or shoulders, creating enormous stress on their spinal columns and leg muscles. Most water carriers developed severe spinal deformities within a few years of beginning work, as their bodies adapted to the constant pressure of heavy loads by developing curved spines and enlarged shoulder muscles. The distances involved in water carrying were often considerable, as water sources might be located far from the areas where water was needed most. Water carriers would walk miles each day, carrying full containers to their destinations and empty containers back to be refilled. The cobblestone streets and uneven surfaces of medieval cities made this walking even more difficult, as carriers had to maintain their balance while carrying heavy loads over surfaces that could cause them to trip or fall at any moment. The routes that water carriers traveled daily were often through the most dangerous and unsanitary parts of medieval cities, exposing them to additional health risks and social hazards. They had to navigate through areas where human and animal waste was commonly disposed of in streets, where criminal activity was frequent, and where diseased individuals might congregate. The early morning and late evening hours, when much of their work was done, provided cover for robbers and other criminals who saw water carriers as easy targets, burdened as they were with heavy loads that made escape impossible. The water sources themselves were often contaminated and dangerous, as medieval cities lacked the infrastructure and knowledge necessary to maintain clean water supplies. Wells were frequently located near cesspits, animal pens, and other sources of contamination, while rivers and streams were polluted with waste from tanneries, butcher shops, and other businesses that dumped their refuse directly into waterways. Water carriers had no way to assess the safety of the water they were transporting, and they were among the first to be exposed to waterborne diseases that could spread throughout entire communities. The containers used for water transport were heavy, awkward, and often dangerous to handle when filled to capacity. Most were made from wood, leather, or crude ceramics that could weigh considerable amounts even when empty. When filled with water, these containers could weigh over 100 pounds and had to be lifted, carried, and maneuvered through narrow doorways and up steep staircases. The containers lacked proper handles or carrying systems, forcing workers to bear the weight directly on their backs and shoulders in ways that caused severe spinal compression and joint damage. The competition among water carriers was fierce and sometimes violent, as there were always more people desperate for work than there were opportunities for employment. Established water carriers jealously guarded their routes and customer relationships, sometimes resorting to intimidation or sabotage to prevent newcomers from encroaching on their territory. This competition kept wages artificially low and prevented water carriers from organizing for better working conditions or fair treatment from their customers. The seasonal variations in water carrying work created additional hardships that made it difficult for workers to maintain steady incomes or plan for the future. During winter months, water sources might freeze over, requiring carriers to break ice or travel longer distances to find flowing water. The containers would freeze during transport, making them even heavier and more difficult to handle, while icy conditions made walking treacherous and falls more likely. In summer, the increased demand for water meant longer working hours and greater physical stress, while the heat made the work more exhausting and dangerous. The health consequences of water carrying extended beyond the immediate physical injuries caused by heavy lifting and repetitive strain. The constant exposure to contaminated water sources meant that water carriers had higher rates of intestinal diseases, skin infections, and other illnesses related to poor sanitation. The physical deformities caused by years of carrying heavy loads made water carriers easily identifiable in their communities, marking them as members of a laboring class that was looked down upon by more prosperous citizens. The social status of water carriers was low, even among manual laborers, as their work was seen as requiring no special skills or training that might command respect or higher wages. They were often treated as interchangeable and disposable workers, whose individual welfare was of little concern to their customers or employers. This lack of social standing made it difficult for water carriers to advocate for better working conditions or to seek help when injured or unable to work due to the accumulated damage caused by their profession. The family life of water carriers was severely impacted by the physical demands and irregular hours of their work. Men who spent their days carrying heavy loads were often too exhausted to participate fully in family activities or household responsibilities, while the chronic pain and disability that developed over time made them increasingly dependent on family members for basic care. The irregular income from water carrying made it difficult to support families adequately, leading to cycles of poverty and desperation that could persist for generations. The economic situation of water carriers was particularly cruel, as their essential service was paid at extremely low rates, despite the enormous physical demands of the work. Most water carriers were paid per delivery, creating pressure to carry as much water as possible on each trip to maximize their earnings. This led many to overload themselves beyond what their bodies could safely handle, resulting in injuries that would end their careers and leave them destitute. The competition among water carriers was fierce, as there were always desperate people willing to take on this back-breaking work for even lower wages. Mill workers and grain processors faced their own unique set of physical challenges, working in facilities where the constant noise, dust, and mechanical dangers created an environment that was hazardous in multiple ways. Medieval mills used water wheels or windmills to power heavy grinding stones that would crush grain into flour. But operating these facilities required workers to handle enormous bags of grain, maintain dangerous machinery, and work in conditions filled with flour dust that could damage their lungs and even cause explosive fires. The process of milling grain began with workers carrying 100-pound sacks of grain from storage areas to the grinding stones, a task that required lifting these heavy loads multiple times throughout each work shift. The grinding stones themselves were massive pieces of carved stone that could weigh several tons, and they required constant maintenance and adjustment to ensure proper operation. Workers had to climb around these moving stones to make adjustments, clear jams, and replace worn parts, all while the machinery continued to operate at dangerous speeds. The flour dust created during the grinding process posed serious health risks that weren't understood at the time. Workers would spend their entire shifts breathing air thick with fine particles that would gradually coat their lungs and create respiratory problems that grew worse over time. Many mill workers developed what we would now recognize as occupational asthma, though they had no understanding of what was causing their breathing difficulties. The dust also created fire and explosion hazards, as flour particles suspended in air could ignite from the smallest spark, creating devastating explosions that could destroy entire mills and kill everyone inside. Road builders and maintenance workers in medieval times faced the enormous challenge of creating and maintaining transportation networks using only hand tools and human labor. The Roman road system had largely deteriorated by the medieval period, and new road construction was a massive undertaking that required workers to move enormous quantities of stone, earth, and other materials without any mechanical assistance. The construction of a medieval road began with surveying and clearing the route, which often involved cutting through forests, draining swamps, or carving paths through rocky terrain. Workers used axes, saws, and other hand tools to clear trees and brush, then had to remove the stumps and roots by digging them out with shovels and picks. This preliminary work was backbreaking and time-consuming, often taking months to complete even relatively short stretches of road. Once the route was cleared, workers had to grade the roadbed by moving massive quantities of earth and stone. This was accomplished entirely through human muscle power, with workers using wheelbarrows, carrying baskets, and simple hand tools to move materials that might weigh hundreds of tons for even a short section of road. The physical demands were enormous, requiring workers to lift, carry, and move heavy loads for 10 to 12 hours a day in all weather conditions. The laying of stone surfaces required additional specialized skills and enormous physical strength. Workers had to quarry stone blocks, transport them to the construction site, and then fit them together to create durable road surfaces. Each stone had to be shaped by hand using hammers and chisels, then lifted into position and adjusted until it fit perfectly with surrounding stones. The precision required for this work, combined with the physical demands of handling heavy stones, made road construction one of the most challenging occupations in medieval society. Perhaps the most psychologically traumatic category of medieval employment included jobs that required workers to regularly confront human suffering, death, and moral degradation on a scale that would destroy the mental health of most modern people. These occupations not only exposed workers to horrific sights and experiences, but also forced them to participate in activities that violated basic human decency and compassion. Battlefield scavengers and corpse robbers occupied one of the most morally ambiguous positions in medieval society, performing work that was both necessary and deeply disturbing. After major battles, someone had to clear the fields of dead and wounded soldiers, strip the bodies of valuable equipment and clothing, and dispose of the remains. This work was typically done by the poorest members of society, people so desperate for income that they were willing to rob the dead and sort through the aftermath of human carnage. The work of battlefield scavenging began while battles were still in progress, as scavengers would follow armies and move on to battlefields even before the fighting had completely ended. They would search among the dead and dying soldiers, looking for weapons, armor, jewelry, and other valuable items that could be sold or traded. This work required them to step over and around mutilated corpses, listen to the groans and cries of wounded men, and sometimes even hasten the deaths of those who were too injured to survive, but not yet dead. The timing of battlefield scavenging was crucial, as the most valuable items would be claimed quickly by competing scavengers, while delays could mean that valuable materials would be gathered by others, or that armies would return to reclaim their equipment and punish anyone found looting their dead. This created enormous pressure to begin scavenging as soon as possible after battles ended, often while wounded soldiers were still alive and calling for help. The moral conflict between helping the wounded and gathering valuable materials for survival created psychological trauma that many scavengers never fully resolved. The types of items that battlefield scavengers sought were diverse and reflected both the material culture of medieval warfare and the desperate economic circumstances that drove people to this work. Weapons were among the most valuable finds, as swords, axes, and other military equipment were expensive to produce and always in demand. However, removing weapons from corpses was often difficult and dangerous work, as bodies might be trapped under fallen horses or other debris, while the weapons themselves might be. Armor presented both opportunities and challenges for battlefield scavengers, as it was extremely valuable but also heavy and difficult to remove from corpses. Mail shirts and other metal armor had to be carefully cut or peeled away from bodies that might be partially decomposed or severely wounded, while the weight of the armor made it difficult to transport large quantities. The condition of armor found on battlefields was often poor, as it might be damaged by weapons, stained with blood and other bodily fluids, or contaminated with disease from the corpses it had protected. Personal belongings found on battlefield corpses provided insights into the lives that had been suddenly ended, creating additional psychological burdens for scavengers who had to handle intimate items belonging to the dead. Letters from loved ones, religious medallions, family portraits, and other personal effects reminded scavengers that the corpses they were robbing had been living human beings with families, hopes, and fears just like themselves. Some scavengers tried to return personal items to families when possible, while others simply discarded them as worthless, but either choice carried emotional consequences that added to the trauma of their work. The disposal of stripped corpses was a major concern for battlefield scavengers, as leaving large numbers of unburied bodies could lead to disease outbreaks that would affect entire regions. However, the burial of battlefield dead was expensive and time-consuming work that cut into the profits from scavenging operations. Many scavengers would simply strip valuable items and leave corpses for others to deal with, while some would participate in mass burial operations that were often hasty and inadequate for preventing disease transmission. The relationship between battlefield scavengers and military authorities was complex and often hostile, as armies needed scavengers to clear battlefields, but also viewed them as vultures who profited from human suffering. Some military leaders would hire scavengers directly to clear battlefield sites, while others would attempt to prevent scavenging in order to maintain respect for their fallen soldiers. This inconsistent treatment meant that scavengers never knew whether they would be welcomed, tolerated, or punished for their activities. The seasonal nature of medieval warfare meant that battlefield scavenging was irregular work that could not provide steady income throughout the year. Scavengers had to find other sources of income during peacetime, often turning to equally unpleasant occupations, such as disposing of executed criminals, cleaning up after natural disasters, or working in other areas where their experience with death and violence might be useful. This irregular employment pattern made it difficult for scavengers to maintain stable family lives or plan for the future. The competition among battlefield scavengers was intense and sometimes violent, as valuable battlefields might attract hundreds of scavengers who would fight among themselves for access to the most promising areas. Established scavenging groups would sometimes use violence to exclude newcomers from lucrative sites, while individual scavengers might resort to weapons to protect valuable finds from competitors. This violence among scavengers added another layer of danger to work that was already physically and psychologically traumatic. The psychological impact of this work was devastating. Scavengers would see hundreds or even thousands of dead bodies after major battles, many of them horribly mutilated by weapons or trampled by horses. They would handle corpses that were still warm, remove clothing and equipment from men who had been alive just hours earlier, and sort through personal belongings that told stories of the lives that had been suddenly ended. Many battlefield scavengers turned to alcohol or other forms of escape to cope with the horror of their daily experiences. But perhaps even more traumatic was the moral ambiguity of their position. While their work was necessary for clearing battlefields and recovering valuable military equipment, it also involved robbing the dead and sometimes preventing wounded soldiers from receiving help. Scavengers were often accused of murdering wounded men to steal their belongings. And while some of these accusations were undoubtedly true, many scavengers were simply trying to survive in a world that offered them few other options for earning a living. Plague doctors and medical workers during epidemic periods faced a different but equally traumatic set of psychological challenges. During outbreaks of bubonic plague, cholera, and other epidemic diseases, medical workers were expected to treat patients despite having no effective treatments to offer and no protection against infection. They would watch hundreds of patients suffer and die, knowing that their own survival depended largely on luck rather than skill or precaution. The daily routine of a plague doctor during an epidemic was a nightmare of human suffering that would continue for months or even years. They would make rounds through plague hospitals, private homes, and temporary treatment centers, examining patients whose bodies were covered with painful swellings, bleeding sores, and other horrific symptoms. The stench of death and disease was overwhelming, as many facilities lacked adequate ventilation or waste removal systems. The famous plague doctor costume, with its long beak-like mask filled with aromatic herbs, was an attempt to protect the wearer from infection, but it also created an additional psychological burden by isolating doctors from normal human contact. The masks made communication difficult and created a barrier between doctor and patient that prevented the normal human connections that might have made the work more bearable. Plague doctors became sinister figures in their communities, symbols of death and disease rather than healing and hope. The mortality rate among plague doctors was extremely high, as prolonged exposure to infected patients made their own infection almost inevitable. Most plague doctors who worked through major epidemics eventually contracted the diseases they were treating, and few survived. This knowledge created a constant state of anxiety and dread that affected every aspect of their lives. Many plague doctors wrote journals or letters describing their experiences, and these documents reveal the profound psychological trauma caused by months of watching people die while knowing that the same fate likely awaited them. Wet nurses and those who cared for children during periods of high infant mortality faced perhaps the most heartbreaking psychological trauma of any medieval workers. In an era when infant mortality rates could reach 50% or higher, those who cared for children were forced to watch large numbers of infants and young children suffer and die from diseases, malnutrition, and accidents that were largely preventable by modern standards. Wet nurses, who breastfed infants whose mothers had died in childbirth or were unable to nurse, often cared for multiple children simultaneously, knowing that many would not survive to adulthood. They would become emotionally attached to the children in their care, only to watch them waste away from childhood diseases or malnutrition. The constant cycle of caring for children who would likely die created a form of chronic grief that could last for decades. The working conditions for wet nurses were often harsh, as they were expected to be available to nurse infants around the clock while receiving minimal compensation for their services. Many wet nurses were women who had lost their own children and were desperate for income, making their work emotionally devastating on multiple levels. They would sometimes nurse children of wealthy families while their own surviving children went without adequate care or nutrition. Orphanage workers and others who cared for abandoned children faced similar psychological challenges. Medieval orphanages were overcrowded, underfunded institutions where children lived in conditions that virtually guaranteed high mortality rates. Workers in these facilities would watch children die regularly from disease, malnutrition, and neglect, while being powerless to provide adequate care due to lack of resources and knowledge. The emotional toll of this work was compounded by the social attitudes toward orphaned and abandoned children, who were often viewed as unwanted burdens rather than individuals deserving of care and compassion. Orphanage workers were frequently blamed for the high death rates in their institutions, even though they were working with inadequate resources and facing impossible circumstances. Many developed a form of emotional detachment as a survival mechanism, but this detachment often came at the cost of their ability to form normal human relationships outside of work. The cumulative effect of years spent caring for children who regularly died was profound psychological damage that manifested in various ways. Some workers became obsessively religious, viewing the deaths of children as God's will and their own suffering as a form of spiritual trial. Others turned to alcohol or other forms of escape, while still others simply became emotionally numb, going through the motions of their work without allowing themselves to feel the full impact of the tragedy surrounding them. Yet, despite these horrific working conditions and psychological burdens, it's important to recognize that medieval workers developed remarkable resilience and found ways to cope with circumstances that would overwhelm most modern people. They created support networks within their communities, developed informal systems of mutual aid, and often found meaning in their work despite its terrible demands. Many dangerous professions had strong guild systems that provided some protection for workers and their families. Mining guilds, for example, often maintained funds to support the widows and children of miners killed on the job, while construction guilds developed primitive safety rules and training programs that slightly reduced accident rates. These guilds also provided social connections and a sense of identity for workers who might otherwise have been completely isolated by the nature of their work. Religious faith played an enormous role in helping medieval workers cope with dangerous and unpleasant jobs. Many viewed their suffering as a form of spiritual trial that would be rewarded in the afterlife, while others found comfort in the belief that their work, however humble or despised, served God's purposes. Religious festivals and holy days provided breaks from work and opportunities for workers to connect with their communities in contexts that weren't defined by their occupations. Family and community bonds were also crucial for survival in these harsh occupations. Extended families often worked together in dangerous trades, sharing knowledge, providing mutual support, and caring for those who were injured or disabled by their work. Community networks provided informal insurance systems where neighbors would help families whose breadwinners were killed or disabled, while also maintaining social connections that helped workers retain their sense of humanity despite the dehumanizing nature of their jobs. Even within the worst occupations, there were opportunities for advancement and improvement that provided hope for better circumstances. Skilled executioners might be recruited by wealthy patrons or royal courts, improving both their working conditions and their social status. Successful miners might become mine supervisors or start their own small operations, while talented construction workers could advance to become master masons or architects. The apprenticeship system, despite its many flaws, also provided some opportunity for social mobility and skill development. Young people entering dangerous trades would receive training and guidance from experienced workers, learning not just the technical skills of their profession, but also the survival strategies that might help them live longer and work more safely. Master craftsmen, even in despised trades, took pride in passing their knowledge to the next generation and often developed genuine affection for their apprentices. Some medieval communities developed surprisingly sophisticated approaches to occupational health and safety, given the limitations of their knowledge and technology. Venice, for example, developed regulations governing the working conditions in its famous glass-making industry, recognizing that certain practices were particularly dangerous and needed to be controlled. Some mining operations developed ventilation systems and safety procedures that reduced death rates, while certain construction projects included provisions for medical care and compensation for injured workers. Women in medieval society faced their own unique set of occupational challenges and often worked in jobs that were dangerous or unpleasant in different ways from those typically performed by men. Female textile workers, for example, spent long hours in poorly lit conditions doing detailed handwork that frequently damaged their eyesight. Midwives faced enormous risks from exposure to diseases and difficult births, while female servants in wealthy households were vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Brewing was one occupation where women often found opportunities for independence and economic success, but it also involved significant health risks from exposure to various chemicals and fermentation processes. Female brewers, known as alewives, were essential to medieval communities, but also faced suspicion and persecution, particularly during periods when brewing became more regulated and male-dominated. The legal and social structures that governed medieval work were complex and varied significantly from one region to another, but they generally provided little protection for workers and heavily favored employers and property owners. Serfs and other bound laborers had virtually no legal rights and could be forced to work in any conditions their lords demanded, while even free laborers had little recourse when faced with dangerous working conditions or unfair treatment. However, the guild system did provide some forms of protection and representation for skilled workers in certain trades. Guilds could negotiate working conditions, set standards for training and apprenticeship, and provide mutual support for their members. They also maintained some quality control over their trades, which indirectly protected workers by ensuring that tools and materials met certain standards. The relationship between medieval workers and the church was complex and often contradictory. While Christian teachings emphasized the dignity of all work and the spiritual value of suffering, the church hierarchy often supported social systems that kept workers in poverty and dangerous conditions. However, individual clergy members and religious institutions sometimes provided aid and comfort to workers, and religious festivals and observances offered respite from the harsh realities of daily labor. Technological limitations were perhaps the most significant factor in creating the harsh working conditions that characterized medieval employment. Without machinery to assist with heavy lifting, transportation, and manufacturing processes, almost all work had to be accomplished through human muscle power, creating enormous physical demands on workers. The lack of scientific understanding about diseases, toxins, and safety procedures meant that workers were exposed to hazards that could have been prevented with better knowledge. However, it's worth noting that medieval workers were not simply passive victims of their circumstances. They developed innovative techniques and tools within the constraints of their technology, created systems of cooperation and mutual aid that helped them survive harsh conditions, and sometimes successfully organized to improve their working conditions and wages. The gradual improvements in working conditions that occurred during the later medieval period came about through a combination of factors, including technological developments, economic changes, and sometimes successful worker organizing. The Black Death, for example, killed so many workers that survivors were able to demand better wages and working conditions, leading to some improvements in the lives of agricultural laborers and craftsmen. Trade and commerce also played a role in improving some working conditions, as successful merchants and craftsmen accumulated wealth that allowed them to invest in better tools, equipment, and working conditions. The growth of towns and cities created new economic opportunities and sometimes provided workers with alternatives to the most dangerous and unpleasant rural occupations. Education and literacy, though limited to small portions of the population, also contributed to improvements in some occupations. Written records of successful techniques, safety procedures, and business practices could be preserved and shared, leading to gradual accumulations of knowledge that made some forms of work safer and more efficient. The legacy of medieval working conditions continued to influence labor practices for centuries after the medieval period ended, and many of the struggles faced by medieval workers would be familiar to industrial workers in later periods. The fight for safe working conditions, fair wages, and dignity in employment has been a constant theme throughout human history, with medieval workers representing one chapter in this ongoing story. Yet despite all the hardships, dangers, and suffering in medieval work, it's remarkable to consider how much human civilization advanced during this period. The great cathedrals, castles, and other architectural achievements of the medieval period still inspire awe today, built entirely by workers using hand tools and human labor. The agricultural innovations that supported growing populations, the craft techniques that created beautiful and durable goods, and the trade networks that connected distant parts of the world were all accomplished by people working in conditions that we would consider intolerable. The stories of medieval workers remind us of the enormous human cost behind historical achievements that we might otherwise take for granted. Every stone in a medieval cathedral represents hours of back-breaking labor by workers who risked their lives to create something beautiful and lasting. Every piece of medieval craftsmanship reflects the skill and dedication of artisans who worked despite constant dangers and hardships. Every agricultural innovation that helped feed growing populations was developed by farmers who struggled against harsh conditions and primitive technology. These historical perspectives on work and labor also provide valuable context for understanding modern employment issues. While working conditions in developed countries have improved dramatically since medieval times, many of the fundamental challenges faced by workers, the need for safe working conditions, fair compensation, dignity in employment, and protection from exploitation, remain relevant today. Workers in developing countries still face conditions that would be familiar to their medieval counterparts, while even in wealthy nations, certain occupations continue to involve significant risks and hardships. The resilience, ingenuity, and determination shown by medieval workers in the face of impossible circumstances continue to inspire respect and admiration. Their ability to find meaning, create beauty, and maintain human dignity while working in conditions of extreme hardship demonstrates the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to endure and overcome adversity. Their stories remind us that the foundations of our modern world were built through the sacrifice and suffering of countless individuals whose names we will never know, but whose contributions we continue to benefit from today. As we conclude this exploration of the worst jobs in medieval history, it's worth reflecting on how far we've come in terms of working conditions, safety standards, and workers' rights, while also acknowledging that the struggle for dignity and fairness in employment continues around the world. The medieval workers whose stories we've examined would probably be amazed by the working conditions available to most people in developed countries today. Yet they would also recognize many of the fundamental human needs and aspirations that continue to drive workers' movements and labor rights advocacy. Their legacy reminds us that progress in working conditions doesn't happen automatically, but requires constant effort, organization, and vigilance to maintain and improve. The guild systems, mutual aid societies, and informal networks that helped medieval workers survive and sometimes improve their conditions were early forms of the labor unions and worker protection systems that we rely on today. The technological innovations that eventually made work safer and less physically demanding grew out of centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience, much of it gained through the suffering and sacrifice of workers who had no choice but to perform dangerous jobs with primitive tools and methods. Their experiences provided the foundation for our understanding of occupational health and safety, even though they paid a terrible price for that knowledge. Perhaps most importantly, the stories of medieval workers remind us that every person deserves dignity in their work, regardless of how humble or unpleasant their occupation might be. The gong farmers, tanners, miners, and countless others whose stories we've explored were human beings with hopes, fears, families, and dreams, not just economic units to be exploited and discarded. Their humanity remained intact despite the dehumanizing conditions they faced, and their dignity persisted despite society's attempt to deny it to them. In our modern world, where we sometimes take our improved working conditions for granted, these historical perspectives can help us appreciate how much progress has been made, while also recognizing how much work still needs to be done. The fight for safe, dignified, and fairly compensated work continues around the world, and the example of medieval workers who persevered despite impossible circumstances can inspire us to continue working toward a world where no one has to choose between earning a living and maintaining their health, safety, and human dignity. The absolute worst jobs in medieval history serve as powerful reminders of both human suffering and human resilience. They show us the depths of hardship that people can endure, while also demonstrating the remarkable capacity for survival, adaptation, and even hope that characterizes the human experience. These stories honor the memory of countless workers whose sacrifices helped build the foundation of our modern world, while also challenging us to ensure that such extreme exploitation and suffering are never again accepted as normal or inevitable parts of the human experience. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.